You have watched people who seem less intense than you, less deep than you, find their place with ease, and in the silence that followed, a question formed that you have never said out loud. This message answers it. Choose the hook that resonates most with you, or ask for more alternatives. There is a sentence that was spoken over your life, not always in words. Sometimes in the way a conversation shifted when you said what you actually thought. Sometimes in the way a relationship quietly withdrew when you showed up fully. Sometimes in the way a community that claimed to welcome everyone made it subtly but unmistakably clear that the version of you that arrived was more than the version they had space for. The sentence says that you are too much, too intense, too sensitive, too passionate, too direct, too present, too something, and that something, whatever it is presented not as a quality that overflows, but as a fundamental defect, as evidence that something in you is miscalibrated, as the reason why the spaces you have moved through could never quite contain you comfortably. And over time, over environments and relationships and seasons that seemed to confirm this diagnosis, you began to believe it, not necessarily in a conscious and articulated way, but in the behavior, in the way you monitor yourself before you speak, in the way you measure the intensity of your responses to stay within the limits of what others seem able to tolerate, in the way you translate your deepest thoughts into more digestible versions before sharing them, in the way you arrive somewhere having already prepared a reduced version of yourself, not out of dishonesty, but out of precaution, out of the painful wisdom of someone who has learned that the full version of who they are regularly exceeds what the available environments can hold. Chosen. I am speaking to you, not to a general audience, to you who are watching this video at this precise moment in your life, to you who know exactly what I am talking about, because you have been living it long enough to have stopped naming it in your conversations with others. This message exists to dismantle that sentence at its root, not to tell you that you have no areas of growth, we all do, but to tell you with a precision that I hope reaches the places in you where that sentence has planted its deepest roots. The problem was never the size of what you are. The problem was always the size of the spaces you were asked to live in. You are not too much. You were simply misplaced. Let me describe with precision what it feels like to grow up, or to live, in an environment that does not have the capacity to contain what you are. It starts very early for most people who carry this kind of wound. It starts in a space that should have been safe. A family, a school, a community, in which you gradually realized that the way you existed naturally created friction, not because of bad intentions on your part, not because of a lack of love from the people around you, but because of a fundamental gap between the capacity of the environment and the size of what you brought into that environment without even being aware of it. You asked questions that the adults did not know how to answer, questions that made them uncomfortable rather than curious. You felt things at a depth that exceeded what the people around you seemed to experience, and that depth was treated as oversensitivity rather than as interior richness. You saw connections between things, you perceived nuances. You were interested in questions that others your age did not seem to find important. And instead of being recognized as someone unusually perceptive, you were treated as someone unusually complicated. And gradually, with the patience and precision of a process that is never brutal but always effective, you learned to reduce yourself, to ask smaller questions, to feel less openly, to present a version of yourself that better matched what the environment could process. You became an expert in the art of preemptive reduction, of anticipated self-censorship. You knew, before even opening your mouth, what percentage of what you actually wanted to say was acceptable in that particular context. And you delivered that percentage, and you kept the rest somewhere inside yourself, in a place that became increasingly crowded over the years, waiting for a context that never quite seemed to arrive. Chosen. There is something particularly painful about this kind of wound that I want to name honestly. It is not a spectacular wound. It is not the kind of suffering that people easily recognize as suffering. Nobody mistreated you in an obvious way. Nobody explicitly said you were worthless or unimportant. What happened was much more subtle and much more insidious than that. It was the repetition of the experience of being too large for the available spaces, of bringing something and seeing that something received not as a gift but as a problem to manage, of showing up fully and seeing that fullness trigger withdrawal rather than welcome. And the message that this repetition transmits, silently, systematically, with an efficiency that explicit messages never achieve, is that the size of what you are is the problem. That if you could be a little less intense, a little less passionate, a little less deep, a little less present, everything would go better. The relationships would be easier, the environments would be more comfortable, you would be more lovable, more accessible, easier to be around. The message says that the solution is reduction, and you ended up believing it. There is also something this wound does to the relationships you form as an adult. You often attract people who need you, who need your intelligence, your energy, your capacity to show up fully in moments when others withdraw. These people genuinely benefit from what you bring, but they do not necessarily have the capacity to receive you in return in the same way you receive them. And you find yourself in dynamics that look like relationships but are actually arrangements in which you give a great deal and receive little. Not because the others are bad, but because you have unconsciously chosen relational environments whose size corresponds to what you have grown accustomed to. Spaces that are too small. Relationships that can contain you when you reduce yourself but not when you fully deploy. Do you recognize this? The specific exhaustion of giving fully to spaces that can only receive a portion of what you offer. You have the right to recognize it. You do not have to pretend it is not real. That exhaustion is not the sign of something wrong with you. It is the sign of someone whose full size has never yet had the right container. Here is the truth that heaven wants to place in the deepest layers of your understanding today. The problem was never the size of what you are. The problem was always the size of the spaces you were asked to live in. This shift in perspective is not a way of avoiding personal responsibility. It is a way of seeing with precision what actually happened. Because the difference between these two readings of the same experience is absolutely decisive for what comes next in your life. If the problem is in you, if you are fundamentally too much, fundamentally miscalibrated, then the solution is permanent reduction, perpetual moderation, self-censorship as a way of life. But if the problem is not you but the placement, if what you are is real and valid and precious and simply too large for the particular spaces you have been placed in, then the solution is completely different. The solution is repositioning. David, and I want you to look at this story from an angle you may never have considered. David was too much for his father's house before he was in his right place on the throne of Israel. In his father's house he was the ignored youngest, the one they did not even think to present to the prophet Samuel when he came to find the king among Jesse's sons. He was so little regarded in that particular space that his own father did not think to include him in the list of possible candidates. In 1 Samuel 16 verse 11, Samuel has to ask Jesse directly, "Are there no more young men?" And Jesse answers almost as an afterthought, "There remains yet the youngest. He is keeping the sheep. Too small, too young, too much a shepherd." Not the profile, but this same David that his father did not judge worthy of presentation was precisely the man God had chosen for the throne. The family space could not contain him, not because he was not enough, but because he was too much. Not too much as a defect. Too much as a mismatch between the size of what he was and the size of the space he was in. Here is the first truth I want to anchor in your understanding. What the wrong spaces called your defect is actually the description of your destination. The environments that told you that you were too intense, too deep, too passionate, too demanding. They were not describing you incorrectly. They were correctly describing the gap between your size and their capacity. The same intensity that was excessive in those spaces will be exactly what is required in the spaces that await you. The same depth that was a problem in those relationships will be precisely what enables the connections that are destined for your life. O Tozer. This American theologian, whose spiritual depth remains unmatched in the English-speaking world, wrote that it is impossible to keep your heart right with God and your life small at the same time. That there is a size to every calling, and that the pressure you feel to fit into smaller spaces than the one you were built for is always working against the very thing God placed in you to be deployed. Here is the second truth. The reduction you practiced to survive in spaces that were too small protected you, but it is now costing you more than it is protecting you. There was wisdom in learning reduction. There was real survival intelligence in the ability to adapt to environments that did not have the size to fully receive you. That adaptation allowed you to function, to maintain relationships, to navigate spaces that would have been even more painful if you had shown up without any adaptation. But that survival strategy has a lifespan. It was appropriate for the seasons when adequate spaces were not yet available. But if you continue to practice reduction in seasons when adequate spaces are beginning to appear, if you enter the right spaces with the habits of the wrong ones, you will reproduce in the right spaces exactly what you experienced in the wrong ones. In Romans 12 verse 2, Paul writes, "Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind." The Greek word translated as conformed, suschematizo, means literally to be molded into the external shape of something. That is exactly what preemptive reduction does. It molds you into the shape of the spaces around you, rather than letting you be the shape God gave you. And Paul says, do not do that. Be transformed from within. Let your identity come from the truth of who you are in God, rather than from the pressure of the environment surrounding you. Here is the third truth, and this is the one I want you to carry with you long after this message ends. God did not create you too large for the available spaces. He created you exactly the size of the spaces He has prepared for you. The size of what you are is not an accident. It is not an excess. He was tolerating while hoping you would eventually learn to contain yourself. It is intentional design, precise architecture. The depth of your sensitivity, the intensity of your passion, the capacity of your intelligence, all of it was dimensioned for the specific spaces toward which God is leading you. In Ephesians 2 verse 10, Paul writes, "For we are His workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand, that we should walk in them." You are His workmanship, not a rough draft, not a work in progress that needs to be corrected down to a smaller size. His workmanship and the works for which you were created were prepared in advance. They already exist, they are waiting for you, and they were dimensioned for exactly what you are. Not the reduced version, not the version adapted to spaces that were too small. You, the full version of you, chosen. My question for you today is this. In what area of your life are you still reducing yourself right now? And what would be different if you genuinely stopped? Let that question find the places in you where the reduction is still automatic, because those are the places where the repositioning needs to begin. Let me show you what happens in a life when someone genuinely understands, not intellectually, but in their bones, that they were not too much but simply misplaced, and begins to live from that truth rather than from the sentence that had been imposed on them. The first transformation is in the way they enter spaces. Before this understanding, for someone who has internalized the message that they are too much, entering a new space is almost always preceded by a preemptive assessment, a rapid and often unconscious reading of the capacity of that space. How much of me is acceptable here? What percentage of what I am can I bring without triggering the withdrawal I have learned to fear? This assessment happens in seconds. It is automatic, and it almost always results in the entry of a reduced version. Smaller, more adapted, more managed, before even having evidence that the reduction was necessary. When the truth of repositioning genuinely settles in, when the understanding that the problem was placement and not size becomes a living conviction rather than a pleasant idea, this preemptive assessment begins to change in nature. It does not disappear immediately. Survival habits are deeply inscribed and do not uninstall overnight. But something changes in the quality of the assessment. It becomes less automatic, less preemptive, more based on the current evidence of the particular space you are in, rather than on the accumulated evidence of past spaces. And progressively, in the spaces that prove to genuinely have the capacity to receive the full version begins to arrive. And when the full version arrives in a space that has the capacity to receive it, something happens that is difficult to describe to someone who has not yet experienced it. A recognition, not from an impersonal space, from the people in that space, who see something in the full version that they could not see in the reduced version, who respond to depth with depth, to passion with a capacity to receive it and even to call it forth. And in that recognition, in that experience of being seen and received without having had to reduce yourself first, something repairs in the places that the repetition of spaces that were too small had damaged. The second transformation is in the way you choose relationships. Before repositioning, for someone whose history is marked by the repeated experience of being too large for the available spaces, the choice of relationships is often influenced by a form of painful familiarity. You are drawn toward people and dynamics that resemble what you know. Relational spaces in which you can function in your reduced version because your reduced version is the one you have practiced the most. These relationships are not bad. The people in them are not bad, but they have a structural limit. They cannot receive you beyond the point to which you reduced yourself to enter them. After repositioning, after the understanding that you are not too much but simply misplaced begins to govern your choices, something changes in what you look for in relationships. You begin to look for relational spaces that have the capacity to receive the full version, that can hold depth without being overwhelmed by it, that can match intensity rather than being exhausted by it, that can receive passion and see it for what it is, a gift rather than a problem to manage. These relationships exist, they are waiting for you, and they are impossible to form as long as you arrive in every new relationship with the relational habits of the wrong spaces. The third transformation is perhaps the deepest. It is the transformation in the way you speak to yourself in the silence, that inner voice, which for years has been colored by the sentence, which has translated every relational difficulty and every environmental mismatch into confirmation that you are fundamentally too much. That voice begins to change register, not dramatically, not overnight, but progressively. In the moments where the old voice would have said you are too much for this space, a different voice begins to offer a different reading. This space is too small for you. That is not arrogance, that is accuracy. And accuracy, the ability to read your experiences precisely rather than through the distortion of the old sentence, is one of the most liberating transformations a person can go through. The fourth transformation, the one that makes all the others possible, is in the way you understand your own story. Before repositioning, the sentence too much colored the entire narrative of your life. Every environment that could not contain you seemed to confirm the diagnosis. Every relationship in which you had reduced yourself seemed to be proof of its truth. The narrative was coherent, painfully, exhaustingly coherent, because it explained everything through the lens of your fundamental excess. After repositioning, that same narrative, the same events, the same environments, the same relationships, reads completely differently. Not because the facts have changed, but because the interpretive framework has changed. The environments that could not contain you are no longer evidence of your excess. They are evidence of their insufficiency. The reductions you practiced are no longer confirmations of your problematic size. They are testimonies of your survival intelligence in conditions that were not designed for you. And the adequate spaces that are beginning to appear, the relationships that can hold the full version, the environments that respond to your depth with depth, are no longer inexplicable surprises. They are the confirmation of what God had prepared from the beginning, chosen. I want to finish with this: the full version of you, the one you have only rarely delivered, the one you have kept in that increasingly crowded interior place while waiting for a space large enough. That version has value, real value, value that is not diminished by the fact that the spaces of the past did not have the capacity to receive it. the capacity of a space to receive something does not determine the value of that something. It only determines the adequacy of that particular space. You do not have to continue paying the price of reduction to live in spaces that were not built for you. You do not have to continue translating your deepest thoughts into more digestible versions for environments that do not have the depth to receive them as they are. You have permission, divine permission, rooted in the way you were created, to be entirely yourself in the spaces that were built to receive you entirely. Those spaces exist. The relationships that can hold the full version of what you are exist, the environments that have the capacity to welcome your depth, your passion, your intensity, not as problems to manage, but as gifts to receive. They exist, and they are not accessible to the reduced version. They were not built for it, they were built for you, for the full, unedited, non-preemptive, fully deployed version of what God designed when He created you. The repositioning begins today. Not with a dramatic decision or an immediate radical change, but with something simpler and more fundamental. With the decision to no longer accept as definitive truth the sentence that the wrong spaces imposed on you. With the decision to begin reading your experiences of mismatch, not as evidence of your excess but as information about the inadequacy of the spaces. With the decision to begin looking actively, deliberately, with the patience of someone who now knows what they are looking for the spaces that were built to your size. You are not too much. You never were. You were simply in the wrong spaces. And the right spaces, the ones that were prepared to receive everything you are waiting for you. What breaks you open is what lets the light in.